For 3 centuries, the galaxy had whispered the same truth. Humanity was extinct. The Terran homeworld was a dead rock, its colonies scattered ash, its people nothing more than cautionary tales told by elder species around dying stars. The great galactic powers, the crystalline Zephyrians, the hive-minded Kefar, the ancient machine collective known as the Nexus, had divided up human space like scavengers picking clean a carcass. But what happens when the dead refuse to stay buried? What happens when every surveillance drone, every deep space probe, every long-range scanner across 100 systems suddenly detects the impossible? Massive energy signatures emerging from the void between stars, signatures that match no known technology in the galactic database. What happens when the sky itself seems to tear open like fabric, revealing not the empty darkness of space, but the running lights of 10,000 warships that should not, could not exist? The answer came on a Tuesday, Standard Galactic Time, when Admiral Vexhai of the Zephyrian Defense Fleet received a transmission on an ancient frequency that had been silent for 300 years. The voice was human. The message was simple. We've been waiting. This is the story of humanity's longest con, their greatest deception, and their most beautiful revenge. This is the story of what happens when a species refuses to die quietly, when they choose instead to disappear into legend, only to return as something far more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. This is the story of the day the dead came home. The crystal spires of New Zephyr gleamed like frozen lightning against the purple dawn, their surfaces catching and refracting the light of 3 suns into prismatic rainbows that painted the sky in impossible colors. Admiral Vexhai stood on the observation deck of the orbital defense station, her crystalline form humming with barely contained energy, as she watched the morning ritual of a billion Zephyrians beginning their day below. 300 years of peace. 300 years since the last human ship had been hunted down and destroyed in the Outer Rim territories. 300 years since her people had claimed this sector of space, building their crystal cities on worlds that had once housed the strange, fleshy bipeds who called themselves human. The Zephyrians had always found humans fascinating in the way one might find a particularly clever insect fascinating. They were short-lived, chaotic, driven by emotions that made no logical sense to a crystalline being whose thoughts moved like light through structured matrices. But they had also been surprisingly resourceful, surprisingly tenacious, and surprisingly difficult to completely eliminate. The war had lasted 30 years. Humanity had fought with a desperation that bordered on madness, using tactics that no civilized species would consider: kamikaze runs, biological warfare, the deliberate destruction of their own colonies to deny them to the enemy. In the end, it hadn't been enough. The combined might of the Zephyrian Empire, the Kethvar Collective, and the ancient Nexus machines had proven too much for a single species, no matter how determined. The last human stronghold had fallen on Kepler 442b, a rocky world on the edge of what had once been called the Terran Federation. Vex's Hay had been there, a junior officer then, watching as the final human fleet made their last stand in the system's asteroid belt. She remembered the way their ships had fought to the very last, ramming Zephyrian dreadnoughts even as they broke apart, broadcasting defiant messages on all frequencies until their communication arrays were silenced forever. The humans had died as they had lived, loud, chaotic, and refusing to accept defeat even when it stared them in the face. Admiral. The voice of her aide, Crystallis Jextan, cut through her memories like a blade through silk. We're receiving an unusual transmission. Vex's Hay turned, her form shifting from the contemplative purple of memory to the sharp blue-white of attention. Define unusual. It's coming from the void between systems. No visible source. And, Admiral? Jex Tarm paused, his crystalline form flickering with uncertainty. It's on a human frequency. The words hung in the air like a challenge to physics itself. Vexi felt her internal resonance shift to the deep crimson of alarm. That's impossible. All human communication networks were destroyed centuries ago. Yes, Admiral, but the transmission is definitely originating from an old Terran emergency channel. Channel 7, Alpha, Zulu. I've checked the archives 3 times. Vex Hay's form went perfectly clear. A Zephyrian's equivalent of going pale. Channel 7, Alpha, Zulu had been humanity's primary military distress frequency. It had been monitored by every human ship and station in their former territory. The last transmission on that frequency had been the final message from the dying defenders of Kepler 442b. Remember us. Play it, she commanded, her voice creating harmonic overtones that made the air itself vibrate. The transmission was short, Just 5 words in the crude verbal language that humans had used before their extinction. But those 5 words made Vexhi's crystalline structure ring like a struck bell. We've been waiting, coming home. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then the station's proximity alarms began to wail, and the tactical displays exploded into frantic activity as sensors detected something impossible emerging from the void. "Admiral!" Senior tactician Murdoch's voice was sharp with panic. Massive energy signatures detected at the edge of the system. Emergence pattern consistent with... With what? Vexhay demanded. With a fleet translation, a large one. "Admiral, the energy readings are off the scale. Whatever's coming through, it's big." The main display shifted to show the long-range sensor feed from the system's edge. Space itself seemed to ripple and tear like fabric, reality bending in ways that made the Zephyrian crew's crystalline forms dim with confusion. Through the tears in space-time came ships. But these weren't the crude metal constructs that humanity had once used. These vessels seemed to be made of something that absorbed and reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They were massive, some of them dwarfing the largest Zephyrian dreadnoughts, and they moved with a grace that seemed to mock the very concept of mass and inertia. "How many?" Vexhay whispered. "Still counting, Admiral. Current tally is 3,417. No, wait. More emerging. 4,000. 5,000. Murdath's voice trailed off in disbelief. The fleet that emerged from the void was unlike anything in the galactic databases. The ships moved in perfect formation, their dark hulls seeming to bend light around them like living shadows. They didn't broadcast any identification signals, didn't respond to hails, didn't even register on conventional sensors except as massive gravitational distortions. "Admiral," Communications Officer Valfara reported, her phone flickering with confusion. "I'm detecting multiple similar emergent signatures throughout the sector. The Kefvar Collective is reporting the same phenomena in their space. So is the Nexus." Vexhay felt something she hadn't experienced in centuries. Fear. Not the tactical caution of facing a known enemy, but the primal terror of confronting something completely beyond comprehension. "Send a standard challenge," she ordered. "All frequencies. Demand identification." For long moments, there was no response. Then, as if in answer to her command, every screen on the station flickered and displayed the same image. A human face. But this wasn't the soft, flesh-covered visage that Vexhay remembered from the archives. The being that looked back at her had skin that seemed to be made of the same light-bending material as the ship's. His eyes were pools of starlight, and when he smiled, it was with the cold patience of someone who had waited 300 years for this moment. "I am Admiral Marcus Kane, formerly of the Terran Federation Navy, currently of the Human Diaspora Fleet." His voice was exactly what Vexhay remembered. That odd musical quality that human vocal cords produced. But there was something underneath it now. Something vast and patient and utterly alien. "I believe we need to talk." Throughout the Zephyrian Command Center, crystalline beings flickered between colors of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The Human Diaspora Fleet? It was impossible. Humanity was extinct. They had made sure of that. "You're dead," Vexhay managed to say. "Your species is extinct. We hunted down every lost ship, every lost colony. We made certain." Kane's smile widened, and in that expression was 3 centuries of patient planning, of careful preparation, of methodical revenge. "Did you?" "Admiral Vexhay, yes, I know who you are. Did you really think you had found all of us? Did you really think that a species clever enough to spread across 100 worlds wouldn't have contingency plans?" The massive human fleet had spread throughout the system now, their ships taking up positions that spoke of military precision and careful planning. They weren't attacking, weren't making any aggressive moves, but their presence was undeniably threatening. "It was like being surrounded by sleeping predators. When you drove us from our worlds," Kane continued, his image now appearing on every screen throughout the Zephyrian system, "you thought you had won a clean victory. You catalogued our ships, counted our colonies, tracked our refugees. You were very thorough, but you made one crucial mistake." "What mistake?" Vexhay asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "You assumed we would fight fair." The words sent a chill through every Zephyrian in the system. Their species prided itself on honorable warfare, on clean victories achieved through superior technology and tactics. The concept of a prolonged deception, of deliberately losing battles to serve a larger strategy, was almost incomprehensible to them. "While you were hunting our fleets," Kane explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher addressing slow students, "while you were destroying our colonies, while you were congratulating yourselves on the extinction of humanity, we were doing something else entirely. We were leaving." "Leaving for where?" Vexay demanded. "We mapped every human settlement, tracked every refugee ship. There's nowhere in the galaxy you could have hidden an entire species." Kane's laugh was like the sound of a funeral bell. "Who said anything about hiding in the galaxy?" The implications of those words hit Vexay like a physical blow. Her crystalline form flickered through the entire spectrum as her mind struggled to process what he was suggesting. "The void between galaxies," she whispered. "The empty space. But that's impossible. No species could survive out there. No technology could sustain life in that environment for 300 years. No known technology," Kane corrected. "But then, you never really understood human technology, did you? You saw our metal ships, our chemical rockets, our crude computers, and you assumed that was all we were capable of. You never bothered to study our greatest strength, which was what? Adaptation." Kane's image leaned forward, his star-filled eyes boring into hers across space and time. "You crystalline beings, you Kethvar hive minds, you ancient machines, you're all products of stable environments. You evolved to perfection within narrow parameters and then stopped growing. But humans? We're the products of a chaotic world that tried to kill us every day for millions of years. We learned to adapt or die. On the tactical displays, the human fleet was moving with impossible precision. Ships that should have taken hours to change course were pivoting like dancers, their movements coordinated with a precision that spoke of technology far beyond anything in the galactic database. "So when you drove us out," Kane continued, "when you forced us to choose between extinction and exile, we chose a third option. We chose transformation. We spent 300 years in the void between galaxies, with nothing but time and necessity to drive us. 300 years of adapting to an environment that should have killed us. 300 years of becoming something new." "What did you become?" Vexay asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Kane's smile was sharp as a blade. "We became what we always were, Admiral. We became the monsters under your bed, the nightmare you tell yourselves could never be real. We became the species that refuses to die quietly." Throughout the Zephyrian fleet, commanders were frantically trying to analyze the human ships, to understand their technology, to find some weakness that could be exploited. But their sensors returned impossible readings, energy patterns that shouldn't exist, mass distributions that defied physics, propulsion systems that seemed to operate on principles that hadn't been discovered yet. "Your scans are useless," Kane observed, as if reading their thoughts. "Our ships aren't built from matter as you understand it. They're constructed from compressed space-time, held together by principles we learned in the void. They exist partially in this dimension and partially in others. They are, quite literally, impossible by the standards of physics you understand." "What do you want?" Vexay finally asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Kane's expression grew serious, and for a moment the alien nature of what he had become was overshadowed by something unmistakably human: grief for the dead and love for the living. "We want what was stolen from us. Our worlds, our homes, our right to exist in this galaxy. For 300 years, you've lived in our houses, breathed our air, walked in our gardens. For 300 years, you've told yourselves that you were the victors, that you had the right to take what was ours because you were stronger. The human fleet was moving now, not aggressively, but with the patient inevitability of a tide. Ships began taking up positions around every Zephyrian installation in the system, not close enough to be immediately threatening, but close enough to make their point clear. But strength isn't just about who has the bigger guns," Kane continued. "It's about who's willing to pay the higher price. And we've paid a price you can't imagine. We've sacrificed our humanity itself to ensure our survival. We've become living weapons, forged in the void, tempered by 3 centuries of exile." "You're talking about war," Vexay said. "No," Kane replied, and his smile returned. Cold, patient, terrifying. "We're talking about collection of debts. War is what you waged against us 300 years ago. This is accounting." The transmission ended, leaving the Zephyrian command center in stunned silence. Outside, the impossible human fleet continued its patient deployment, each ship a reminder that the galaxy had changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. Vexay stood frozen, her crystalline form dim with shock, as reports flooded in from across Zephyrian space. Human fleets were emerging everywhere, at every former human world, every former human colony, every system that had once belonged to the extinct species. The pattern was clear. Humanity wasn't just returning to one world or even one system. They were coming home to everything that had once been theirs. And from the reports coming in from Kethvar and Nexus Space, it appeared that humanity's definition of home had grown considerably larger during their 300-year absence. The age of easy victories was over. The dead had returned, and they had brought bills that would have to be paid. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the neutral space station Concordia, a massive structure built at the intersection of three major trade routes where the territories of the galaxy's dominant species met. The station had been designed as a symbol of peace and cooperation, its architecture incorporating elements from every major civilization: Zephyrian crystal spires, Kethvar organic curves, and the geometric precision of Nexus construction. Today, it felt more like a tomb. Admiral Vexay materialized in the Zephyrian delegation pod, her crystalline form still flickering with the unstable energy patterns of deep stress. Across the circular chamber, she could see her counterparts from the other major powers: Hive Queen Zixthara, of the Kethvar Collective, her insectoid form surrounded by a cloud of communication drones, and Primary Node 7741 of the Nexus, a geometric construct of metal and light that processed information faster than most organic minds could comprehend. They had been the triumvirate that ruled the galaxy for 3 centuries. 3 species so different in nature that they rarely competed for the same resources, making their alliance one of mutual benefit rather than necessity. Together they had carved up human space, divided human worlds among themselves, and consigned humanity to the dustbin of galactic history. Now, that history was demanding a reckoning. Status report, Vexay requested, as her delegation took their assigned positions. The holographic display in the center of the chamber came alive with tactical data that painted a picture of impossible scope. Red markers indicated human fleet positions, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of contacts spread across the galaxy like a malignant constellation. The situation is unprecedented. Primary Node 7741 began, its voice a harmonious blend of electronic tones. Human fleets have emerged simultaneously in 2,847 systems across our combined territories. Their technology appears to be based on principles unknown to our science. Initial engagement protocols have proven ineffective. Hive Queen Zixthara's mandibles clicked in agitation. Ineffective is a diplomatic term for catastrophic failure. 3 of our scout fleets have simply vanished. No debris, no energy signatures, no communications. They engaged human vessels and ceased to exist. Vexay felt her form shift to a darker hue. The Zephyrian 4th Fleet attempted to challenge a human formation near our industrial world of Crystalis Prime. The human ships, I'm not certain how to describe what happened. They seemed to phase partially out of our dimension, becoming untouchable, then returned to normal space behind our formation. They disabled our entire fleet without firing a single shot we could detect. How? Primary Node 7741 inquired, processing the tactical implications. Unknown, Vexay admitted. Our ships simply lost all power simultaneously. When power was restored, we found small devices attached to each vessel, objects no larger than a human fist that had somehow bypassed our shields, our armor, and our internal security systems. The devices were removed, but our technicians can't determine how they functioned. They appear to be composed of materials that don't register on any of our instruments. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. These weren't primitive humans struggling with inferior technology. These were beings who had transcended the conventional understanding of physics itself. What do they want? Hive Queen Zixthara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The main display shifted to show recordings from across the galaxy. Human admirals making the same speech that Marcus Kane had delivered to Vexay, but with subtle variations tailored to each audience. The message was consistent. Humanity was reclaiming what had been taken from them. They want everything, Vexay said simply. Every world we took from them. Every system we claimed. Every colony we established on the ashes of their civilization. And they're not negotiating. That's impossible. Primary Node 7741 stated with the absolute certainty of a machine. Even if they possess superior technology, the logistical requirements for occupying thousands of worlds simultaneously exceed the capabilities of any single species. The population required alone. Who says they need population? Vexthara interrupted. We've been thinking about this problem in conventional terms, but nothing about this situation is conventional. What if they don't need to physically occupy worlds? What if they've developed technology that makes traditional concepts of territory and control obsolete? As if summoned by her words, the chamber's communication system activated, and the face of Admiral Marcus Kane appeared on every screen. He looked exactly as he had in his previous transmission, ageless, composed, and utterly confident. "Honorable members of the Galactic Council," he began, his tone carrying the polite formality of a diplomat delivering an ultimatum. "I trust you've had time to assess your situation." "What do you want, Kane?" Vexerhay demanded, abandoning diplomatic protocol. Kane's smile was patient. "I thought that would be obvious. We want what any displaced people want, to go home." "This is your home?" Hive Queen Zixthara gestured with one of her 4 arms to encompass the chamber and, by extension, the galaxy beyond. "After 300 years of absence, you claim ownership of worlds you've never seen, systems you've never settled?" "Time doesn't diminish legitimate claims," Kane replied. "If I leave my house for 300 years, it doesn't cease to be my house simply because someone else moves in during my absence, especially if my absence was involuntary." Primary Node 70741's lights flickered in the machine equivalent of confusion. The human species numbered approximately 12 billion at the time of the final conflict. Our estimates suggest that fewer than 50 million humans could have escaped the final purges. How does a population of 50 million claim dominion over thousands of worlds?
Kane's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering how much to reveal.
"You're still thinking in terms of the old paradigm. Biological populations, physical occupation, resource distribution based on traditional needs. But we're not the same species that fled into the void 3 centuries ago." He gestured, and the display shifted to show images that made the assembled delegates recoil in shock. These weren't recordings of human fleets or human technology. They were images of humans themselves. But these beings bore little resemblance to the biological creatures that had once populated human space. The figures on the screen moved with inhuman grace, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid metal made sentient. Some appeared to be pure energy contained in roughly humanoid shapes. Others seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their forms flickering between states of matter that shouldn't coexist. "We call ourselves the diaspora," Kane explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone describing a fundamental truth. "Not because we were scattered, but because we chose to become scattered. Dispersed not just through space, but through dimensions, through states of being, through possibilities that your science hasn't discovered yet."
"What are you saying?" Vexhay whispered. "I'm saying that the 50 million humans who entered the void weren't just running away.
We were evolving, transforming, becoming something that could survive in environments where biological life was impossible. And in the process, we discovered something remarkable." Kane paused, letting the suspense build. "We discovered that consciousness isn't dependent on biology. Identity isn't limited by physical form. A single human mind, properly prepared and enhanced, can exist across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. What you see as a fleet of 10,000 ships is actually a manifestation of a dozen human consciousnesses, each capable of controlling thousands of vessels simultaneously." The implications hit the delegates like a physical blow. They weren't facing an invasion by millions of humans. They were confronting a dozen godlike beings who had transcended the limitations of biological existence. "Impossible," Primary Node 7741 stated, but its conviction had wavered. "Is it?" Kane asked. "Your own species proves that consciousness can exist in non-biological forms. The Kethvar demonstrate that individual identity can be subsumed into collective consciousness. The Zephyrians show that thought can move at the speed of light through crystalline matrices. We simply took these concepts to their logical conclusion." "And what conclusion is that?" Hive Queen Zixthara demanded. "That evolution doesn't stop at the boundaries of flesh and blood. That intelligence, once freed from the constraints of biology, can become something magnificent. We spent 300 years in the void not just surviving but transcending. Every challenge that should have killed us instead taught us new ways to exist." Kane's image leaned forward, and for a moment his star-filled eyes seemed to look directly at each delegate individually. "We learned to exist as pure information, traveling between dimensions as easily as you travel between rooms. We learned to manipulate matter at the quantum level, building ships from compressed space-time itself. We learned to stretch our consciousness across vast distances, inhabiting multiple bodies simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination." "But why return?" Vexhay asked. "If you've transcended physical existence, why do you care about planets and systems and territory?" Kane's expression grew sad. And for a moment the alien being he had become was overshadowed by something unmistakably human. Grief for what had been lost. Because transcendence doesn't mean forgetting who we were. We carry within us the memories of every human who lived, every child who played in Earth's gardens, every artist who painted Earth's sunsets, every dreamer who looked up at Earth's stars and imagined exploring them. We are the living memory of our species, and those memories deserve to be honored. The display shifted again, showing images of Earth, not as it was now, a dead rock orbiting a dying star, but as it had been 300 years ago. Blue oceans, white clouds, green continents teeming with life. It was a world none of the current delegates had ever seen, but its beauty was undeniable. We want to restore what was lost, Kane continued, to rebuild the worlds that were destroyed, to resurrect the cities that were razed, to replant the gardens that were burned, not because we need these things for survival, we've transcended such needs, but because they represent the dreams and hopes of billions of humans who never got to see them fulfilled. And if we refuse? Primary node 7741 asked. Kane's smile returned, cold and patient. Then you'll discover what 12 transcendent consciousnesses can accomplish when they stop being polite. As if to demonstrate his point, every system in the chamber suddenly went dark. Emergency lighting didn't activate, backup power didn't engage. For a terrifying moment, the station's life support systems themselves seemed to pause, leaving the delegates floating in absolute darkness and silence. Then, just as suddenly, everything returned to normal. But the message was clear. The humans could reach into the most secure facilities in the galaxy and shut down any system they chose. They had demonstrated their power without firing a shot or causing a single casualty. We're not interested in conquest in the traditional sense, Kane said, as if nothing had happened. We don't want to rule over other species or impose our will on galactic civilization. We simply want our homes back. All of them. How long do we have? Hive Queen Zixthera asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Standard galactic cycle. 1 year by your reckoning. That should give you sufficient time to evacuate our worlds and relocate your populations. We're not unreasonable. We'll provide assistance with the relocation process. The galaxy is vast, and there are plenty of worlds that were never ours to begin with. And if we fight? Vexay asked. Kane's expression grew infinitely sad. Then you'll learn why even transcendent beings sometimes weep. We've spent 3 centuries becoming something magnificent, Admiral. But we've never forgotten how to be something terrible. Please don't force us to demonstrate both capabilities. The transmission ended, leaving the 3 delegates alone with their thoughts and their fears. Outside the chamber, their respective fleets waited for orders that none of them were qualified to give. How do you fight an enemy that exists partially outside of reality? How do you negotiate with beings who can manipulate the fundamental forces of physics? Options? Vexai asked after a long silence. Limited Primary Node 7741 replied. Military resistance appears futile. Economic sanctions would be ineffective against entities that don't require traditional resources. Diplomatic isolation is impossible when they can reach into our most secure facilities at will. What about calling their bluff? Hive Queen Zixthara suggested. They claim to be transcendent beings, but they're still communicating with us, still making demands. That suggests they're not as far beyond our reality as they claim. Or it suggests they're being merciful, Vexhai countered. They could have simply appeared and started reclaiming worlds by force. Instead, they're giving us time to evacuate. That doesn't sound like bluffing. That sounds like the restraint of beings who have the power to take everything they want, but are choosing to be civilized about it. Primary node 7741's lights flickered in rapid patterns as it processed probabilities. Analysis suggests that compliance with their demands is the optimal strategy. The cost of resistance appears to far exceed the cost of relocation. You're suggesting we abandon everything? Zigstara demanded. 3 centuries of colonization, terraforming, development, trillions of beings who call those worlds home now? I'm suggesting we choose the option that results in the fewest casualties, primary node 77401. Replied with machine-like logic, the humans have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our understanding. Resistance would likely result in the destruction of our fleets and the forced evacuation of our colonies anyway. At least this way, we have time to plan an orderly withdrawal. Vexhay found herself thinking about the human she had known 3 centuries ago. Not the transcendent being that Kane had become, but the desperate species that had fought to the last ship, the last breath, the last heartbeat. They had been outmatched then,
overwhelmed by superior numbers and technology.
But they had never stopped fighting, never stopped looking for an advantage, never stopped believing that somehow they could win. Now the advantage was theirs, and they were offering terms instead of demanding unconditional surrender. Perhaps transcendence had taught them something about mercy as well as power. "There's another consideration," she said slowly.
What happens if we agree to their terms? What guarantee do we have that they'll stop with their former territories?
What's to prevent them from deciding they want our core worlds as well? It was primary node 7741 who answered, its electronic voice carrying a note of what might have been respect. "Nothing. But consider the alternative.
If we fight and lose, we'll have demonstrated that we view them as enemies. Entities with their capabilities might conclude that enemies are too dangerous to leave alive.
If we comply with their demands, we establish a precedent of peaceful coexistence. You're saying we should trust them?
I'm saying we should trust their enlightened self-interest.
They claim to want to honor the memory of their species and restore what was lost. That suggests they still value life, even life that isn't their own. But if we force them to choose between our survival and their goals, the machine didn't finish the thought, but it didn't need to. They all understood what was being left unsaid. The dead had returned and they were offering terms. The question was whether the living were wise enough to accept them. 6 months had passed since the Galactic Council's emergency session, and the galaxy was transforming in ways no one could have predicted. The Great Evacuation, as historians would later call it, had begun immediately after the 3 major powers announced their decision to comply with human demands. But what had been expected to be a chaotic exodus of frightened populations had instead become something unprecedented in galactic history. The largest cooperative effort ever undertaken by multiple species. Admiral Vexay stood on the bridge of the evacuation coordinator vessel Crystal Harmony, watching as the last Zephyrian transport lifted off from the surface of New Kepler, a world that had been a crown jewel of their empire for 2 centuries. Below, the crystal cities that her people had built were already beginning their transformation, not destruction, but metamorphosis. The humans hadn't lied about providing assistance with the evacuation. They had done far more than that. They had revolutionized it. "Admiral," her communications officer reported, "the human coordinator is requesting permission to begin the restoration process." Vexay nodded, her crystalline form reflecting the strange mixture of loss and wonder she felt. "Granted." The being that materialized on her bridge wasn't Marcus Kane, but someone who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, formerly of the Terran Colonial Development Corps. Like Kane, she had been transformed by humanity's 300-year exile, but where Kane's presence felt vast and intimidating, Chen radiated the focused intensity of a master craftsperson preparing to work on a beloved project. "Thank you for your patience, Admiral," Chen said, her voice carrying harmonics that somehow made the words feel both alien and comfortingly familiar. "I know this must be difficult for your people. Less difficult than we expected," Vexay admitted. "Your relocation technology is remarkable." It was an understatement. The humans had somehow managed to compress the entire process of planetary evacuation into something that took days rather than years. Their ships could literally lift entire cities into space, maintaining full life support and infrastructure, then transport them to new worlds where they could be set down as if they had always been there. "We learned a few things about space-time manipulation during our exile," Chen said with what might have been humor. "Moving large objects across vast distances efficiently was one of the first problems we had to solve." On the display screens, the surface of New Kepler was changing. The evacuation had left behind empty crystal structures, beautiful but lifeless monuments to Zephyrian architecture. But now those structures were flowing, reshaping themselves. The crystals weren't being destroyed. They were being transformed into something new. Something that incorporated elements of both Zephyrian design and patterns that seemed to echo with older, deeper memories. "What are you doing?" Vexay asked, fascination overcoming her sense of loss. "Restoration," Chen replied simply. This world was called Kepler 438b in our records. It had a thriving ecosystem before the war, forests of trees that could live for thousands of years, oceans teeming with bioluminescent life, mountain ranges that sang in the wind. We're bringing it back. How? The ecosystem has been gone for centuries. Even our most advanced terraforming couldn't fully restore a biosphere that complex. Chen's smile held depths that spoke of knowledge gained through suffering and transformation. We carry the patterns within us. Every human who ever walked on this world,
Every scientist who ever studied its life forms, every child who ever collected its shells or pressed its flowers between book pages, their memories are part of us now. We can rebuild what was lost, because we remember it perfectly. The process unfolding on the surface defied everything Vexhay understood about biology and ecology. The humans weren't simply planting seeds or introducing species. They were rebuilding the world from the quantum level up, using their transcendent understanding of matter and energy to recreate not just the forms of living things, but the complex web of relationships that made a biosphere stable.
"It's beautiful," Vexhay whispered, and meant it.
"Thank you, we think so too." Chen paused, then added, "Admiral, would you like to see something that might interest you?" The display shifted to show a different part of the planet's surface, where something unexpected was taking shape. The landscape there incorporated both the organic curves of the restored ecosystem and new structures that were unmistakably crystalline, but not Zephyrian. These crystals seemed to grow from the ground itself, their faceted surfaces reflecting light in patterns that created natural artwork on a massive scale. "We studied the cities your people built here," Chen explained. "They were truly magnificent. We've incorporated some of those design elements into our restoration, not as copies, but as tributes, acknowledgements that this world was shaped by multiple hands, multiple visions. We want to honor that history." Vexhay felt something she hadn't expected: gratitude. The humans weren't simply erasing the evidence of the past 3 centuries, they were acknowledging it, incorporating it, making it part of a larger story. "Why?" she asked. "Why honor the memory of those who displaced you?" Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "Because that's what transcendence means, Admiral. It doesn't mean forgetting the past or pretending that injustices never happened. It means understanding that everyone, even our former enemies, was acting according to their nature, their understanding, their fears. The Zephyrians who claimed this world weren't evil. They were survivors trying to build something beautiful with the opportunities they found. We can honor that impulse, even while reclaiming what was taken." Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out on thousands of worlds. The Great Evacuation had become something unprecedented, not just a withdrawal of occupying forces, but a collaboration between species that had been enemies for centuries. The humans' technology made it possible to relocate entire civilizations without destroying what they had built. More remarkably, their willingness to incorporate elements of post-human development into their restoration projects had transformed potential enemies into partners in an impossible project. "Admiral Vexhay," Chen continued, "there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. A proposal. Go on." "The restoration project is vast, larger than any single consciousness, even a transcended one, can handle efficiently. We could use help. Partners who understand different aspects of planetary development, different approaches to creating beauty from raw materials." Vexhay felt her crystalline structure resonate with surprise. "You're offering us employment?" "We're offering you purpose. The galaxy is full of dead worlds, planets that were never habitable, systems that were damaged by industrial accidents or warfare, moons that could support life but never developed it naturally. We have the power to restore what was lost, but we don't have the perspective to imagine what was never built. Your people are artists in crystal and light. The Kethvar understand organic systems in ways we never could. Even the Nexus machines have insights into efficient urbanization that could benefit the project." The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just reclaiming their lost empire, they were proposing to heal the galaxy itself, to repair centuries of damage and create new wonders that had never existed before. And they wanted their former enemies to help them do it. "What would you want in return?" Vexhay asked. "Partnership," Chen replied simply. "The chance to build something together that's greater than what any of our species could create alone. We've learned that transcendence isn't about becoming isolated from other forms of life. It's about understanding how to work with them more effectively." Before Vexhay could respond, her communications officer announced an incoming transmission from the Galactic Council chambers. The main display shifted to show Marcus Kane. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him were figures that represented all the major powers of the galaxy, not just the 3 species that had participated in humanity's exile, but dozens of others. Ladies, gentlemen, entities, and collective consciousnesses. Kane began with formal gravity. "I'm pleased to announce the signing of the new Concordia Accords, establishing the framework for what we're calling the Galactic Restoration Project." The document that appeared on screen was unlike any treaty in galactic history. Instead of dividing territory or establishing spheres of influence, it committed the signatories to working together to repair damaged worlds, create new habitable systems, and share technologies for the benefit of all species. The age of competition for resources is ending, Kane explained. We've learned to transcend the limitations that made such competition necessary. But transcendence without purpose is meaningless. Our purpose is to make the galaxy a place where every species can thrive, where beauty and knowledge can flourish without limit. Hive Queen Zix Thara appeared on a subsidiary display, speaking for the Keth-Var Collective. The humans have demonstrated that cooperation yields results beyond what any of us could achieve through conflict. We pledge our biological expertise to the restoration effort. Primary node 7741's geometric form flickered into view. The Nexus commits our computational resources to optimizing restoration procedures and coordinating multi-species efforts. One by one, representatives of dozens of species added their commitments to the project. Some offered unique technologies, others contributed knowledge of exotic environments. Still others pledged to serve as mediators or coordinators. What emerged was a vision of cooperation on a scale that the galaxy had never seen. But what about Earth? Asked a representative of the Vegan Trade Coalition, a relatively minor species that had nonetheless been affected by the evacuation orders. What happens to humanity's original homeworld? Kane's expression grew solemn, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of grief. Earth will be restored last, when we've perfected our techniques and healed the damage we carry within ourselves. It will be our masterpiece, the culmination of everything we've learned about creation and renewal. And when it's complete, it will serve as the capital of our new galactic civilization, not human civilization, but the civilization we build together. As the transmission ended, Vexhai found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been the defender of an empire built on conquest and expansion. Now she was being invited to participate in something unprecedented. The deliberate transformation of the galaxy into a garden, where every species could find beauty and purpose. Dr. Chen, she said finally, the Zephyrian Empire accepts your proposal. We'll contribute our expertise in crystalline architecture to your restoration projects. Chen's smile was radiant. Welcome to the team, Admiral. Outside the ship, the restoration of New Kepler continued. But it was no longer just the restoration of a single world. It was the beginning of something greater, the healing of old wounds, the creation of new possibilities, the transformation of a galaxy that had been shaped by fear and competition into something magnificent. The humans had kept their promise. They had come home. But in doing so, they had redefined what home meant. It wasn't just Earth or the scattered worlds of their former empire. Home was the galaxy itself, and they were determined to make it worthy of every species that called it home. As Vexai watched the first of the restored forests beginning to bloom on the surface below, she understood that something fundamental had changed in the universe. The age of species competing for survival was ending. The age of species collaborating for transcendence had begun. And at the center of it all were the humans. Not as conquerors or rulers, but as catalysts for transformation. They had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to them and used it as the foundation for the best thing that had ever happened to the galaxy. The dead had returned. But they had brought with them the gift of life itself, multiplied beyond measure, and shared freely with all who were wise enough to accept it. The sky had torn apart to reveal humanity's hidden armada. But what emerged wasn't an invasion force. It was the seed of paradise, planted in the fertile soil of cooperation and watered with the tears of those who had suffered enough to understand the true value of peace. The war was over. The restoration had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.